outrageous. Secretary of Commerce, who's one of the sort of doves in the administration, Gina Raimondo, just recently said that we have to enlist Europe in our campaign to make sure that China doesn't innovate. What kind of idiocy is that? China's way ahead of the rest of the world in renewable energy. It's put in more solar panels last year than the whole historical record in electrification. So do we want to stop its innovation? Stop its innovation in creating the kinds of advanced technology which might save the world? I mean, this is beyond shocking. And there's no secret about it. The United States has perfectly openly, publicly declared that it's committed to prevent China from economically developing. That's the opposite of what has to be done if we want to survive. Go back. China and Russia and the United States, also others, but primarily China and the United States, are going to have to cooperate to help in mutual aid, or else both will be destroyed.
Global Times reporter Wang Wing, the nearly 95-year-old linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky, is one of the most influential intellectuals in American history, and is called by some as America's eternal opposition. A longtime political commentator, he has been known since the 1960s for his staunch criticism of U.S. foreign policy. The Global Times reporter started contacting the elder in September last year. He readily accepted the interview request, but it was repeatedly postponed due to busy schedules. The interview was finally completed in late May and early June. Chomsky, who is hard of hearing due to his advanced age and requires subtitles in video interviews, has a quick mind and a clear view. In the view of this old man of the century, there are too many historical crimes in the primitive accumulation of the United States dominating the world, and the interests and safety of the American people have been ignored in its own development. Talking about the U.S. policy toward China, Chomsky emphasized, the U.S. must cooperate with China, otherwise both sides will suffer. Much of America's strength comes from horrific historical crimes. Global Times, people are familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel. When human beings were about to join hands to build a tower that could lead to heaven, God made human beings speak different languages so that they could not communicate smoothly in order to stop human beings' plan. As a world-renowned linguist and philosopher, do you think differences in language affect human unity and world peace? Chomsky, language touches everything we do. Language and thought are essentially the same, you can't tell them apart, and it's been that way for thousands of years. Language is what produces thought, and thought is expressed by language. You cannot imagine human life without language. In essence, language sets us apart from other species. I think it's possible for humans to misunderstand based on a misunderstanding of language, but I don't think it's fundamental. The most basic differences have to do with respective interests, ideologies, commitments, propaganda, culture. Sometimes, you are a linguist, but you have been involved in politics since your youth, from the initial Vietnam War, to the war on terror launched by the United States after the 9/11 incident, to the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. You provide constant commentary on political situations around the world and provide insightful critiques of U.S. foreign policy and the legitimacy of U.S. power. This makes you a very controversial figure within the United States. What made you so openly oppose the war? Chomsky, it goes back to my childhood. I wrote my first article in 1939 on the fall of Spain to Franco and the spread of fascism in Europe. Why should I criticize historical crimes? This is our responsibility and a basic moral principle. It is a fundamental principle that we should focus on the things that can make a difference. Global Times, in your opinion, what advantages does the United States still maintain? Chomsky, the United States still has a lot of advantages. America is a free society. This is one reason why it is easier to analyze and even criticize U.S. foreign policy than other countries. Much of America's strength comes from horrific historical crimes. The United States, which has a vast territory and rich resources, once had original people who were massacred and expelled. One of the crimes of the United States is the substantive extinction of the rich Aboriginal culture and society. Another crime is the implementation of the most horrific slavery system in human history, which is also the basis for the accumulation of a large amount of wealth in the United States. In 1945, the United States took over the mantle of world domination from Britain. Over the centuries, the British have committed horrific crimes in building their empire. The US will do the same when it takes over. This is the hegemonic power. In 1947, the US Department of War, which had existed since the colonial era, was renamed the Department of Defense, which meant that from that moment on, the United States would act as the hegemon of the world. America is falling apart and social order is collapsing. Global Times, in your opinion, what problems or challenges does the United States encounter now? Chomsky, the United States has a lot of internal problems, the country is falling apart, and the social order is collapsing. The associated statistics are staggering. Take the past 40 years that have been devastating to society. A major 2020 study by the Rand Corporation, a quasi-government resource company that works primarily for the Pentagon, showed that since early 1980s, President Trump in the 40 years since he took office, the wealth of American society has been transferred from the lower 90% of income groups to the hands of the highest income 1%, with a total amount of about $50 trillion US. This is not a small change. Such changes were accompanied by the destruction of social order and the collapse of the limited welfare system. America is an incredibly wealthy society. If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, the US was well within the bounds of a developed society by most measures, but it's not what it used to be in terms of health spending, infant mortality, and many other things. In fact, America is the only country where working class death rates are actually increasing, not in war years, but in a society that isn't suffering much. Looking at the comparison of the incarceration rate, the United States and Europe were similar in the 1970s. But now, the US incarceration rate is 5 to 10 times that of Europe. This is what so-called neoliberalism has done to the United States for the past 40 years. But this has little to do with the definition of neoliberalism. When you look up neoliberalism in a dictionary or an economics book, they say it's a commitment to free markets and small government. Policy is not like that. The US government fundamentally intervenes in the market, continuously bails out the financial crisis, and subsidizes major industries. The government continues to grow. President Reagan roughly tripled the debt through massive spending and intervention. His 8 years in office began with the largest bank bailout in American history and ended with the savings and loan crisis. The gigantic meltdown in which the American taxpayer steps in and bails out the perpetrators keeps happening, getting worse each time. What's more, there are similar policies not only in the United States, but in the whole of Europe and most of the world, which fills people with anger, resentment, and distrust of institutions. For good reason, they don't do anything about it. This leads to very dangerous consequences. It's a handicap for Trump-style demagogues who can come in and say, when someone stabs you in the back, I'll be your savior. Unfortunately, this isn't a new phenomenon, and it actually takes me back to my childhood. Global Times, you paid special attention to America in the Trump era in your interview Optimistic Not Desperate, Capitalism, Empire, and Social Change in the past 2 years. Do you think America will be great again? Chomsky, whether the United States can solve the current serious problems will not only affect the United States itself, but the strength of the United States will affect the whole world. But there is a background to the emergence of all these problems, and there is a very simple point that must be understood. The United States, China, Russia, India, and other major powers must cooperate or be destroyed. It's a simple fact. Global Times, the 2024 US general election has kicked off, and now it looks like Trump and Biden will continue to compete. What predictions would you make? Chomsky, right now, domestic politics in the United States are polarized. I think it's really unbelievable that Trump and Biden are still going to compete, but that's the reality. The United States and China must cooperate, or both will lose. Global Times, among the several US presidents you have experienced, who do you think has done the best in US domestic governance and who has done the best in foreign policy? Likewise, which American president is the wisest in handling relations with China? Chomsky, the best president I've ever had in my lifetime, Franklin D. Roosevelt, not perfect but generally decent and better than any of his successors. The current policy of the US government towards China is outrageous. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, one of the so-called dubs in the administration, has said we must get Europe to join us in slowing the pace of Chinese innovation. How stupid. We know that China is way ahead of the rest of the world in renewable energy, so are we going to stop its innovation in creating advanced technologies that could save the world? What the United States has done is really shocking. The United States has openly declared that it wants to prevent China's economic development. If we want to survive, we have to do the opposite of what we are doing now. America has to work with China or we both lose. Global Times, what deviations have occurred in the United States' understanding of China? Chomsky, no bias whatsoever. They know China very well. Former Australian Prime Minister, a well-known international relations expert, wrote an article on Australia-China relations. He said, "Why does Australia think China is a threat?" He listed various reasons. Finally, he said, China's threat comes from its existence. For the United States, this is even more of a threat. China not only exists, but also does not obey orders and go its own way. As Keating said, China is there and goes its own way, unlike Europe. The US imposes sanctions on some countries, Europe doesn't like it, the US does this, but they obey, the US. And China's disobedience, the United States, which the United States cannot tolerate, because if the United States is managing the world, then everyone must obey. Global Times, you once published an article titled "War with China or Russia Means, Nice to Meet You, Goodbye, Civilization" on the website of The Australian, saying that the US military hopes to win the war against Russia and China at the same time. This goal is insanely crazy. Why do you say it is impossible for the US to win a war against China and Russia at the same time? But why is the United States really doing such a dangerous and crazy move? Chomsky, as I said, the US government, is insane. You can't go to war with either China or Russia and expect to survive. There can be no war between great powers. Even a preemptive state would self-destruct, and a nuclear winter, the climate catastrophe that would result from a massive nuclear war, would be inconceivable, even without retaliation. Great powers must cooperate. In 2018, the United States formed a strategic policy towards China and Russia, which has now been expanded under the leadership of Biden. This is even worse than insanity. They are interested in power, and they are constantly sacrificing the safety of the American people. The safety of the population is not a high priority. Now, their policies are designed to preserve American primacy and global order, as well as the primacy of American multinational corporations. In fact, there is an interesting case where the US government generally follows the policies of major corporations that play an overwhelming role in the government. But there are exceptions. American economic elites do not approve of confrontation, and American companies do not want to lose the lucrative Chinese market. In fact, the Asian media has published some articles that give a very interesting look at what's going on. For example, Asia Times has conducted a detailed economic analysis of trade flows between countries such as China, Vietnam, Mexico, and the United States. It turns out that US-China trade volume has declined, but China's exports to other countries have increased significantly. At the same time, those countries' exports to the US have also increased, a strong indication that US companies have found ways around trade sanctions they dislike. Building a community with a shared future for mankind is exactly what we must do. Global Times, what changes do you think are taking place in the world order? Chomsky, if you look at what's happening in the world, China's investment and development and foreign engagement are expanding. This has aroused widespread concern at the top of the United States. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have both proposed to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and have become dialogue partners of the organization. In the past, Saudi Arabia has been regarded by the United States as a country in its pocket since its founding. Recently, the settlement agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia was brokered by China, which has also become an important symbol of US policy in the Middle East, failure. These developments are part of a changing world order. Global Times, do you predict that the final resolution of the Ukrainian crisis will end in the way the US and NATO expect? Chomsky, let's look at the options and make a prediction. Either the crisis will be resolved diplomatically, or it won't. If there is no diplomatic solution, then there are two possibilities, either a stalemate or one side surrenders. Which side will surrender? Not Russia. Russia has the ultimate weapon, and if it is threatened, it can always escalate tensions without limit. Will Ukraine surrender? No, as long as the United States wants to continue to promote the war. America also has the ultimate danger. So the only answer that isn't dire is a diplomatic solution. At present, the United States does not want a diplomatic solution. We must continue the war to weaken Russia because that puts Ukraine in a better negotiating position, it claimed. But why should Ukraine be in a better negotiating position as the war drags on? Even if it can, is there any difference? In my opinion, the only hope for a diplomatic solution is the initiative put forward by the Chinese side, China's position on a political solution to the Ukraine crisis, editor's note. Diplomatic negotiations will be very difficult, and the longer the war goes on, the harder it will be. In February 2022, the possibility of a diplomatic solution, such as the Minsk Agreement endorsed by the UN Security Council, before the Russia-Ukraine conflict escalates. This is a high level of international support, and the basic outline is that Ukraine will not join NATO, but remain neutral like Austria during the Cold War. Global Times, what do you think of the Chinese leader's idea of building a community with a shared future for mankind? Chomsky, building a community with a shared future for mankind is exactly what we must do. Our respective interests are getting in the way, but we should move in this direction. We must, or we may all be destroyed. For example, environmental damage has no boundaries, potential epidemics have no boundaries, and nuclear war has no boundaries. Therefore, there must be harmony. The 2023 National Unified College Entrance Examination kicked off today, and the Chinese subject examination of the college entrance examination ended in the morning. There are 7 sets of test papers for this year's Chinese test. Among them, the Chinese test papers in Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin have their own questions, and the composition questions are ordered separately. The Chinese test papers of the college entrance examinations in other provinces are unified by the Education Examination Institute of the Ministry of Education. Let's take a look at this year's composition topics. Which one do you think writing is springing up? National Grade A. People have better control over time due to technological development, but some people have become servants of time. What kind of association and thinking did the sentence arouse in you? Please write an article. Requirements: choose the right angle, determine the concept, clarify the style, draw up the title by yourself, do not copy, do not plagiarize, do not disclose personal information, no less than 800 words. National Volume B. Blowing out other people's lamps will not make you brighter, blocking the way of others will not make you go further. A flower blooming alone is not spring, but 100 flowers blooming together makes the garden full of spring. If there is only one kind of flower in the world, no matter how beautiful that kind of flower is, it will be monotonous. The above 2 materials come from the speeches of General Secretary Xi Jinping, which express common truths in vivid language. Please write an article based on these to reflect your understanding and thinking. Requirements: choose the right angle, determine the concept, clarify the style, draw up the title by yourself, do not copy, do not plagiarize, do not disclose personal information, no less than 800 words. New Curriculum Standard Volume I. A good story can help us express and communicate better, touch our hearts and inspire wisdom. A good story can change a person's destiny and show the image of a nation. Stories are powerful. What kind of associations and thinking did the above materials arouse in you? Please write an article. Requirements: choose the right angle, determine the concept, clarify the style, draw up the title by yourself, do not copy, do not plagiarize, do not disclose personal information, no less than 800 words. New Curriculum Standard Volume 2. The idea of being quiet and not being disturbed mentioned in the language and writing application 2 of this test paper is not uncommon among contemporary teenagers. In their study and life, teenagers sometimes hope to have their own space to relax, settle, and grow. Please write an article combining the above materials. Requirements: choose the right angle, determine the concept, clarify the style, draw up the title by yourself, do not copy, do not plagiarize, do not disclose personal information, no less than 800 words. Peaking role. Micro-writing. Choose one of the following 3 questions and answer accordingly. No more than 150 words. Do not disclose the district, school, and personal information. 1. In recent years, WeChat public accounts have become an important medium for information dissemination. The class is going to create its own official account, but the students have different opinions on whether it is necessary to create one. Please state your point of view and reasons. Requirements: well-reasoned and well-organized. 2. The magazine of the Literature Society intends to set up a reading column of blooming on paper. Please choose a flower-related scene from a classic literary work, and write a short comment based on your own feelings. Requirements: write the name of the work, in line with the content of the work, clear and concise language. 3. Please start with "The Heart Beats So Fast" and write a short poem or a paragraph of lyric text. The topic is self-made. Requirements: sincere feelings, vivid and contagious language. Composition: choose one of the following 2 questions and answer accordingly. No less than 700 words. Write the questions on the answer sheet. Do not disclose the district, school, and personal information. 1. The term continuous voyage, which originally refers to continuous voyage, has been endowed with new meanings in use today, such as continuation for youth, continuation for economic development with technology, etc. Please write an argumentative essay on the topic of continuing life. Requirements: the argument is clear, the evidence is substantial, and the argument is reasonable, the language is fluent and the writing is clear. 2. On the stage, opera actors have moments when they make their debut. There are also many moments of appearance in life: speeches under the national flag, reports of research results, release of new products. Every appearance attracts everyone's attention, every appearance also tells a story. Please write a narrative essay on the topic. Requirements: healthy thinking, substantial and reasonable content, detailed descriptions, fluent language and clear writing. Shanghai Roll. Is a person willing to explore a strange world just because of curiosity? Please write an article to talk about your understanding and thinking on this issue. Requirements: 1. Self-made topic. 2. No less than 800 words. Tianjin Roll. Work with courageous people. Read from no words. Each generation has its mission and challenges, and each generation has its responsibilities and responsibilities. A century ago, Zhou Enlai, a young man studying in Tianjin, wrote this couplet to warn himself in making friends, dealing with affairs and reading for knowledge. After reading this couplet, what kind of associations and thoughts do you have? Please choose an angle, combine your own experience and perception, and write an article. Requirements: self-made title, unlimited style of writing, except poetry, with obvious stylistic features, no less than 800 words, no plagiarism or copying.